Number 1. Amy Bishop was a highly trained biologist and university professor, a woman who, on the surface, embodied academic success. Born in April of 1965 and raised in a middle-class family in Massachusetts, she grew up in a home that valued education and achievement. Her father was an art professor, and Amy followed an ambitious path, studying at respected universities and earning a doctorate in genetics. To colleagues and neighbors, she was a driven, intense scientist, a mother of 4, and someone whose life seemed anchored in work and family. Beneath that outward stability, there were deep fractures. In her early 20s at the family home, Amy shot and killed her younger brother Seth in what was officially ruled an accident. The incident left lasting questions and emotional scars, and years later, investigators would reopen the case. As an adult, Amy faced professional setbacks, conflicts at work, and reports of confrontational behavior. Students complained about her teaching, and coworkers described her as volatile, especially as she battled for tenure at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. The denial of tenure became a crucial turning point. Tenure meant job security, professional validation, and stability for her family. When her tenure request was rejected, it effectively put an end date on her position. By then, she had already invested years building a research program, pursuing patents, and trying to prove her worth. Those around her said she seemed increasingly consumed by anger and a sense of grievance, convinced she had been treated unfairly and that influential people were blocking her success. On a February afternoon in Huntsville, during what was supposed to be a routine biology department meeting, Amy sat among her colleagues in a campus conference room. Faculty and staff gathered around a long table discussing departmental matters. Partway through the meeting, witnesses later said she stood up, produced a handgun, and began firing at the people seated nearest to her on one side of the table. The department chair, Professor Gopi Podila, and 2 other respected colleagues, Professors Maria Ragland Davis and Adriel Johnson, were fatally wounded. Several others were injured. The attack lasted only moments, but it shattered families and deeply wounded the university. After the shooting stopped, surviving colleagues managed to push her out of the room and block the door. Amy left the building and was arrested a short time later outside the campus. Investigators recovered the weapon and began piecing together her history. The case drew national attention for the shock of a professor attacking fellow faculty members and for the revelation that she had earlier been involved in her brother's death in Massachusetts. As the legal process moved forward, prosecutors in Alabama charged her with capital murder and multiple counts of attempted murder. There were questions about her mental health, including suggestions of serious psychiatric illness, and her legal team initially signaled an insanity defense. Over time, the voices of victims' families played a central role. Some of them expressed that they did not want another life taken in response to the crime. In the end, Amy Bishop entered a guilty plea, and the court sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She remains incarcerated in the Alabama state prison system under that sentence. Number 2. Audrey Marie Hilley was in her mid-40s when the full weight of her secrets finally began to surface. To the people of Anniston, Alabama, she appeared to be a classic Southern wife and mother, neatly dressed, polite, active in her community. Born Audrey Marie Frazier in the Blue Mountain neighborhood of Anniston. In early June of 1933, she grew up in a modest but stable household. As a young woman, she married Frank Hilley, a dependable man with a steady job, and together they had 2 children, Mike and Carol. Outwardly, theirs was an ordinary middle-class family. Behind closed doors, though, Audrey's taste for expensive clothes, gifts, and social status pushed the family far beyond their means, and money became a constant source of tension. Over time, Audrey developed a pattern of deception to maintain the image she wanted. She reportedly lied about finances, took on secret debts, and according to later accounts, sometimes traded intimacy with her bosses for money and favors. Friends and relatives described her as charming, but controlling a woman who needed to be admired and who reacted badly when challenged. Financial stress, fear of losing her lifestyle, and a growing comfort with dishonesty formed a dangerous mix. These pressures, combined with what some observers later interpreted as a manipulative personality, set the stage for choices that would devastate her family. In the mid-1970s, Frank began to suffer from a mysterious illness. He complained of stomach pain, weakness, and fatigue. Doctors believed he was dealing with a liver problem and eventually diagnosed infectious hepatitis. Throughout this period, Audrey was by his side giving him food, drinks, and medication she said would help. In late May of 1975, Frank died in the hospital. An autopsy carried out with Audrey's permission showed damage to his organs, but did not test for poison, and his death was written off as natural. Quietly, Audrey collected on a life insurance policy she had arranged on her husband, adding badly needed cash to the family's strained finances. A few years later, her teenage daughter Carol began to experience her own baffling health problems: nausea, weakness, and numbness in her hands and feet. She was rushed to emergency rooms multiple times. Doctors could not find an obvious disease, and at one point suspected emotional causes. All the while, Audrey continued to give her daughter injections and medicine she claimed would ease the symptoms, insisting Carol keep the shots a secret. Eventually, a physician noticed signs that suggested heavy metal poisoning and ordered specialized tests. Hair samples showed extremely high levels of arsenic closer to the scalp, tapering off toward the ends, a pattern consistent with being poisoned over many months. Investigators then turned their attention to Frank's earlier death. His body was exhumed, and this time toxicology testing revealed that he too had arsenic in his system at levels far beyond normal. Police searching Audrey's belongings found a vial in her purse containing arsenic, and a relative later discovered rat poison in a home linked to her. Faced with mounting evidence and a gravely ill daughter, authorities charged Audrey with attempted murder and began building a murder case for Frank's death. Released on bail, she vanished, leaving behind a note hinting at a kidnapping. For a little more than 3 years, she lived under false names, including Robbie Hannon and Terry Martin, even staging her own fake death and returning to her new husband as her twin sister in another state. Suspicious co-workers and an obituary full of inaccuracies eventually drew the attention of police, and she was arrested in New England. Under questioning, she admitted her true identity and was extradited back to Alabama. At trial, prosecutors argued that Audrey had slowly poisoned her husband to cash in on life insurance, and that she had then turned the same method on her daughter after taking out a policy on the girl. Experts described deliberate repeated dosing over time rather than a single impulsive act. Observers and writers later suggested that her behavior fit patterns of a calculating, manipulative personality driven by financial gain and a need for control, though no single psychiatric label fully explained her choices. In the early 1980s, a jury found Audrey Marie Hilley guilty of murdering her husband and attempting to murder her daughter. She was sentenced to life in prison for the murder and an additional term of 20 years for the attempted murder. While serving time, she was considered a model inmate and was granted short furloughs. During one such pass in February of 1987, she escaped. After several days exposed to cold, rainy weather, she was found near Anniston in severe distress and later died in a hospital from hypothermia and exposure, still under an active life sentence from the state of Alabama. Number 3. Jessica Bates McCord was in her early 30s when the child custody battle with her ex-husband reached a breaking point. Long before courtrooms and crime scenes, she was Jessica Callis, born in the early 1970s and raised in a suburb of Birmingham, Alabama. Friends later remembered a girl from a fractured home. Her parents divorced when she was young, and there were reports of violence in the household. Her father, George Callis, was said to be abusive toward her mother and the children, and later in life, he was convicted of murdering his second wife and received a long prison sentence. As a teenager, Jessica was described as rebellious and dismissive of authority, someone who mocked popular classmates and pushed against rules. It surprised many when she began dating Alan Bates, a well-liked, high-achieving student who was active in school activities. Their relationship became intense, and in their senior year, Jessica became pregnant. She left school. Alan stayed to finish, and the couple married young. They went on to have 2 daughters while Alan juggled college and work in theater, trying to build a stable future. Beneath the image of a young family, tension simmered. Accounts from friends and relatives describe Jessica as controlling and quick to accuse Alan of infidelity, even when there was no proof. Over time, the marriage deteriorated. Alan eventually filed for divorce, and Jessica retained custody of the girls. According to later testimony, she frequently left the children with her mother and stepfather for long periods, and began using visitation as a weapon, limiting Alan's access and speaking negatively about him in front of the children. When Alan later formed a serious relationship with an art historian named Tara Klug, who bonded closely with the girls, Jessica's resentment deepened. By the early 2000s, both couples had remarried. Alan and Tara wed and moved to Frederick, Maryland, where he worked as a theater production manager, and she pursued graduate studies. Around the same time, Jessica married a sheriff's deputy, Jeff McCord, whom she met while working briefly as a police dispatcher. That job ended after she was accused of attacking Alan. With Alan now in another state, Jessica repeatedly violated visitation orders, moved often, and made it difficult for him to contact his daughters. A judge eventually held her in contempt of court, and she spent time in jail after ignoring hearings. It was during this period, according to later accounts, that she began talking about a permanent way to stop Alan's legal efforts. On a February day in the early 2000s, Alan and Tara flew to Birmingham for depositions related to the custody case and planned to pick up the girls at Jessica's home in Hoover before driving to visit Alan's parents in Georgia. That evening, they arrived at the McCord house. A note on the front door directed them to the back. Inside, Jessica greeted them and suggested they sit in the den while the children got ready upstairs. Instead, investigators later concluded Alan and Tara were ambushed and shot by Jeff, with Jessica participating in the plan and its aftermath. Their bodies were placed in the trunk of the couple's rental car, which was driven into rural Georgia and set on fire in an attempt to stage a random carjacking. In the early morning hours, a farmer spotted the burning car and called for help. Firefighters and investigators discovered human remains inside. The heat had damaged the vehicle, but the license plate had fallen to the ground intact, leading police back to a rental counter and ultimately to Alan Bates. At the same time, Alan's worried father had called authorities and told them his son and daughter-in-law were in the middle of a contentious custody dispute with Jessica. Investigators quickly focused on the McCords. When questioned, Jeff and Jessica calmly offered the same story: Alan and Tara had never arrived, and the couple claimed they spent the evening on a date complete with movie ticket stubs as supposed proof. Searches of the McCord home and further forensic work began to dismantle that story. Detectives noticed hurried home remodeling in the den. Behind fresh wallpaper, they found a bullet hole leading into the garage and a spent casing that matched a bullet recovered from Alan's body. Blood on a coffee table was identified as Tara's. Phone records showed Jessica's cell phone traveling the same route as the burned car, and calls between the victims' phones were traced to towers along that path. Within days, both Jessica and Jeff were arrested. At trial, prosecutors portrayed Jessica as the driving force behind the murders, motivated by anger, a need for control, and a determination to stop Allen from gaining custody. Witnesses from her past described a pattern of manipulation, vindictiveness, and an expectation that she could talk her way out of consequences. Her mother testified in her defense but was later convicted of perjury for lying about Jessica's whereabouts. The jury found Jessica Bates McCord guilty of capital murder in the deaths of Allen and Tara Bates, and the judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She remains incarcerated under that sentence in the Alabama state prison system. Number 4. Judith Ann Neelley was still a teenager when she became one of the youngest women in American history sentenced to death. Born Judith Ann Adams in the mid-1960s in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, she grew up in a home marked by instability. Her father struggled with alcohol and died in a motorcycle crash when she was about 9 years old, leaving the family emotionally and financially shaken. As a young adolescent, Judith drifted into petty crime and trouble. When she met Alvin Neely, a man nearly a decade older, she was still in her mid-teens. The two quickly formed an intense, chaotic partnership, living out of motels, committing robberies, and moving from place to place across the Southeast. This turbulent lifestyle reinforced a pattern of impulsive decision and disregard for rules. By her later teens, Judith had already been incarcerated in a youth facility, where she even gave birth to twins while in custody. After her release, she reunited with Alvin, and their relationship became the center of her world. Observers later suggested that Judith appeared eager to please him, easily influenced, and willing to go along with his escalating behavior. At the same time, court records and later evaluations painted a picture of someone who was not simply passive, but who could also be manipulative, capable of planning and carrying out serious crimes on her own. In late September of the early 1980s, 13-year-old Lisa Ann Milliken was staying at a youth facility in Rome, Georgia. During a trip to a local mall, she became separated from the group. Judith and Alvin targeted her, luring her away and taking her across state lines to a motel in Scottsboro, Alabama. Over the next days, Lisa was held captive, subjected to repeated abuse and degrading treatment. Judith attempted to kill her using household chemicals, injecting them into Lisa's body in a calculated effort to end her life without attracting attention. When Lisa remained alive but gravely weakened, Judith drove her to a remote overlook in Little River Canyon in northeast Alabama, shot her, and pushed her body over the edge. In a chilling twist, Judith then made a series of anonymous phone calls to law enforcement, calmly directing officers to the canyon and giving enough detail that searchers could find Lisa's body. Those calls would later become key evidence linking a female caller with intimate knowledge of where Lisa had been left. Within days, Judith and Alvin struck again. In early October, they encountered an engaged couple, Janice Chapman and John Hancock, in Rome. The pair were forced into a car. John was shot and left for dead, but miraculously survived later, becoming a crucial eyewitness. Janice was taken back to a motel and killed. The victims in both cases were strangers chosen for their vulnerability rather than any personal grudge. As investigators connected the canyon discovery with Lisa's disappearance, they also followed leads from the surviving fiancé. Descriptions of the attackers and their vehicle pointed toward Judith and Alvin. Around this time, the couple were arrested in Tennessee on unrelated check charges, giving authorities the opportunity to question them about the missing and murdered young women. As detectives dug deeper, they matched Judith's voice to the earlier anonymous calls and traced the couple's movements through motel records and witness statements. Eventually, Judith gave statements that placed her squarely at the center of Lisa's kidnapping and death. Judith was charged in Alabama with capital murder for killing Lisa during a kidnapping. Her trial in Fort Payne lasted several weeks. Prosecutors described a pattern of deliberate cruelty and control, arguing that Judith had not merely followed Alvin, but had taken the lead in key moments. The defense emphasized her youth, her traumatic background, and her dependence on an older dominant husband. Even the trial judge later acknowledged that she was substantially influenced by Alvin, yet the jury still found her guilty of capital murder. They recommended life in prison without parole, but the judge overrode that recommendation and sentenced her to death, making her an 18-year-old mother of 3 on Alabama's death row. Later, she pleaded guilty to the murder of Janice Chapman in Georgia and received an additional life sentence there. For years, Judith's death sentence was upheld on appeal. Then, in the late 1990s, Alabama's governor commuted her sentence to life in prison with the possibility of parole after several decades. The decision was highly controversial and led to a later change in state law aimed at blocking her release. Multiple parole requests have since been considered and denied, and families of the victims continue to oppose any chance of her freedom. Today, Judith Ann Neelley remains incarcerated in the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women in Alabama, serving a life sentence. Number 5. Christie Michelle Scott was a young stay-at-home mother in the small city of Russellville, Alabama, when everything changed in the middle of one summer night. Born in Alabama in the late 1970s, she married Jeremy Scott, and the couple had 2 sons, Mason and Noah. Neighbors saw an ordinary family in a modest house with Christy, often at home with the boys while Jeremy worked and traveled for his job. There was little in the public record about her early life, and to most people, she appeared to be a quiet, attentive mother whose world revolved around her children and her church community. Behind that ordinary surface, prosecutors later argued that growing financial pressure and a pattern of relying on insurance money were building in the background. Court records showed that the Scotts had experienced earlier house fires at a previous residence incidents that led to significant insurance payouts. Investigators would also point to multiple life insurance policies taken out on Mason and his younger brother in the months leading up to the tragedy. Mason, an energetic little boy on the autism spectrum with additional behavioral diagnoses, sometimes struggled at home and at school, adding stress to an already strained household. In the early morning hours of a mid-August day in the late 2000 decade, a fire broke out in the Scott family home on Signore Drive. Jeremy was out of town on business, leaving Christy alone with the 2 boys. As smoke began to spread, Christy and her younger son made it out of the house and ran to a neighbor for help. Emergency crews arrived to find the home engulfed and later discovered 6-year-old Mason in his bedroom. He had died from smoke inhalation and the effects of the fire. At first, many in the community viewed Christy as a grieving mother who had survived an unimaginable loss, and she publicly maintained that the fire was a tragic accident. As investigators examined the scene more closely, troubling details began to emerge. Fire experts concluded that the blaze had been intentionally set, originating in Mason's room rather than in wiring or an appliance. They found a smoke detector that had been removed, a device that should have alerted the household much earlier. Insurance records revealed that Christy had secured multiple policies on Mason, including a substantial new life insurance policy on him shortly before the fire. Autopsy results, which prosecutors discussed carefully in court, suggested that Mason had been given medication that could have made him unusually sleepy, that night raising further suspicion that someone wanted him unable to respond to danger. Roughly a month after the fire, as the evidence mounted and investigators ruled out accidental causes, Christy was charged with capital murder. At trial in Franklin County, the state presented a narrative of a calculated plan. A mother who, facing financial strain and a difficult home life, had seen her son's life insurance as a way out. They emphasized the prior fires, the timing and amount of the insurance coverage, the removed smoke detector, and the expert testimony that the fire was intentionally set. The defense countered that the investigation was flawed, insisting the blaze was accidental, and that Christy loved her son and would never harm him. She took the stand and continued to deny any involvement in starting the fire. The jury ultimately found Christie Michelle Scott guilty on 3 counts of capital murder related to Mason's death. They recommended a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Under Alabama law at the time, however, the judge had the authority to override that recommendation. After a separate hearing, the judge ruled that the aggravating factors, including killing her biological child for financial gain, outweighed any mitigating circumstances and imposed a sentence of death. Christie Michelle Scott was sent to death row at Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women, where she remains incarcerated under that sentence.